Sometimes the sweetest gifts come wrapped in our bitterest moments. Martha Holloway stood behind her folding table at Pine Ridge's Christmas market, watching the wind scatter powdered sugar across her grandmother's apple cinnamon pies like fresh snow on forgotten graves. 3 years since the bank took her bakery, and here she was, a woman who once fed half the county, now watching strangers walk past her final dozen pies as if they were yesterday's newspaper. The December air bit through her wool coat, but not as sharply as the realization that she'd outlived her own usefulness. Then the mountain man appeared. He emerged from the tree line like something out of an old folktale, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark beard and eyes that seemed to hold decades of winter storms. The other vendors fell silent. Martha's hands trembled as recognition hit her like a freight train. Those were the same eyes that had looked at her daughter with teenage devotion 30 years ago. Before he vanished the same night, Emily disappeared forever. "I'll take them all," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and time. But how was Daniel Crawford standing here when the whole town knew he'd died in those woods 3 decades ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Martha's breath caught in her throat, forming a small cloud between them that dissipated like the years themselves. The market seemed to hold its breath. Even Mrs. Peterson at the honey stand had stopped arranging her jars to stare. Daniel Crawford, the boy who'd carved Emily's initials into the old oak behind the high school, the boy who'd promised to take her to prom. The boy who'd been found 3 days after Christmas, his frozen body pulled from Devil's Creek. Except here he stood, very much alive, snowflakes catching in the silver of his beard. "I said I'll take them all." His voice was deeper now, weathered like old leather, but she'd have known it anywhere. "How much?" Martha's fingers found the edge of her grandmother's recipe card tucked in her coat pocket, the one she'd been planning to burn tonight along with everything else that reminded her of better times. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. Something flickered across his face, quick as a shadow. "Price, Martha. What do you want for the pies?" The way he said her name sent ice water through her veins. It held the same gentle reverence he'd used when speaking about Emily all those years ago. She glanced around the market, noting how the other vendors had found sudden interest in their own wares while keeping their ears tuned to the conversation. Pine Ridge thrived on gossip like plants thrived on sunlight, and this would feed the rumor mill through Easter. $60 for the dozen, she managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. He reached into his coat, a heavy canvas thing that looked handmade, and pulled out a roll of bills. Hundreds. He peeled off 3 and laid them on her table beside the nearest pie. "Keep the change." "That's too much." "No," he said, those storm-gray eyes meeting hers. "It's not nearly enough." The weight of his words settled between them like fresh snow. Martha found herself studying his face, searching for the 18-year-old boy she'd once known, the one who'd sit at her kitchen table while Emily finished her homework, the one who'd helped her carry groceries when Bill's back was acting up. The bones were the same, that strong jaw, the aristocratic nose, but life had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. These were the features of a man who'd seen things no one should see. "Where have you been?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Daniel began loading the pies into a wooden crate that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he'd learned to make every action count. "Around." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Martha watched him work, her mind reeling. 30 years. 30 years of believing he was dead, of wondering if things might have been different, if he'd been there that Christmas Eve, if maybe Emily wouldn't have wandered off into the storm. 30 years of carrying the weight of that night, the fight they'd had, the harsh words, the way Emily had run out into the snow with tears streaming down her face. "She's still gone," Martha said quietly. Daniel's hands stilled on the last pie. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind through the market stalls and the distant laughter of children building snowmen in the town square. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain so raw it took her breath away. "I know." 2 words that somehow contained an ocean of grief. Martha felt her carefully constructed walls, the ones that had kept her functioning these past 3 years since losing the bakery, the past 30 since losing Emily, begin to crack. "The whole town mourned you," she whispered. "We buried an empty coffin. Sometimes that's easier than the truth." Before she could ask what he meant, Daniel hefted the crate of pies as if it weighed nothing. The muscles in his forearms were corded with years of hard labor, his hands scarred and calloused. These weren't the soft hands of the boy who used to help her frost cupcakes. Martha. Her name on his lips again, gentle as a prayer. "Thank you." He turned to go, and panic fluttered in her chest. After 30 years of questions, she couldn't let him disappear again. "Wait." But he was already walking away, his boots crunching through the snow toward the tree line. She watched him go, this ghost made flesh, carrying her grandmother's pies like precious cargo. At the edge of the market, he paused and looked back. "They taste the same," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Like home." Then he melted back into the forest as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving Martha standing alone behind her empty table with $300 in her shaking hands and enough questions to fill the hollow spaces in her heart. The other vendors were already whispering. Martha's hands trembled as she folded the $100 bills, the crisp paper foreign against her calloused fingertips. $300. More than she'd made in months of selling her few remaining possessions piece by piece. More than enough to keep the electricity on through January, maybe even February if she was careful. But the money felt tainted somehow, heavy with the weight of 30 years and all the questions Daniel Crawford's impossible presence had stirred up. "Martha? Martha, dear, are you all right?" Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the fog in her mind. The older woman had abandoned her honey stand and was hurrying over, her round face flushed with concern and poorly concealed curiosity. Behind her, Martha could see the other vendors pretending to pack up while straining to overhear every word. "I'm fine," Martha said automatically, the lie as worn and comfortable as her old winter coat. She began folding her empty pie boxes with mechanical precision, muscle memory from 30 years of breaking down her bakery display each evening. But that man, who was he? He looked so familiar, but I can't place. Mrs. Peterson's eyes were bright with the hunger for gossip that kept Pine Ridge's social machinery well-oiled. Martha's fingers stilled on a box corner. Even now, 3 years after losing everything, her first instinct was to protect, to keep secrets, to maintain the careful facade that had gotten her through each day since Bill's death revealed the mountain of debt that had swallowed their bakery whole. "Just a customer," she said quietly. "Someone who appreciated good pie." Mrs. Peterson's expression suggested she wasn't buying it, but Martha had perfected the art of deflection. She finished packing with practiced efficiency, loaded her folding table and empty boxes into the back of her 20-year-old Honda, and drove home through streets that looked the same as they had when Emily was 16, and the future still held promise. Her house sat on Maple Street like a faded photograph of better times. The wraparound porch where Bill used to drink his morning coffee sagged slightly on one corner. The yellow paint had begun to peel around the windows, and the flower boxes Emily had helped her plant were empty now, filled only with snow and the ghosts of summer blooms. Inside, the silence pressed against her like a physical thing. The living room still held the furniture she and Bill had saved up for during their first years of marriage, the burgundy sofa with worn arms, the coffee table scarred from years of Emily's art projects, the bookshelf filled with romance novels she used to read on quiet Sunday afternoons. But the walls told the real story. Pale rectangles marked where family photographs used to hang, pictures she'd sold at the estate sale along with Bill's tools, Emily's piano, and most of her grandmother's china. The only photo that remained sat on the mantel, Emily at 15, laughing as she held up a perfectly frosted birthday cake, flour still dusting her dark hair. Martha sank into her armchair, the one piece she'd refused to sell because it still smelled faintly of Bill's aftershave, and pulled out the $300 bills. The money should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like a door opening onto a past she'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. Her daily routine had become a survival mechanism. Wake at 5:30. Coffee with powdered creamer because real cream was too expensive. Check the newspaper for estate sales where she might find items to resell. Clean houses for the few neighbors who'd hired her out of pity disguised as kindness. Come home to canned soup and the evening news. Sleep. Repeat. It was a grey existence, but it was predictable. Safe. It asked nothing of her heart, demanded no hope, required no dreams. The bakery had been her dream, and look how that had ended. Emily had been her heart, and look how that had shattered. But now Daniel Crawford had walked out of the forest like something from a fairy tale, carrying the weight of impossible answers in his storm-grey eyes. He'd tasted her pies and said they reminded him of home. But how could he know? He'd been 17 when he died, when he'd supposedly died. Martha found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out toward the mountains where he'd disappeared. The peaks rose like sleeping giants against the darkening sky, keeping their secrets buried under blankets of snow. Somewhere up there, Daniel Crawford was eating her grandmother's apple pie and remembering things she'd tried so hard to forget. The rational part of her mind whispered that she should let it go. She'd survived 30 years without answers. She'd built a life, small and careful though it was, on the foundation of not knowing. Some stones were better left unturned. But as she touched the empty space on the windowsill where Emily's ceramic angel used to sit, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years stirring in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, heartbreaking hope, and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for the truth. Martha woke before dawn, with Daniel's words echoing in her mind. They taste the same. Like home. She'd barely slept, her thoughts churning like the wind outside her bedroom window. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she saw his face, older, weathered, but unmistakably the boy who'd once promised Emily they'd build a life together. She made coffee with shaking hands, the routine offering no comfort this morning. The $300 bills sat on her kitchen table where she'd left them, accusatory in the weak morning light. Blood money, her grandmother would have called it. Payment for secrets that should stay buried. But as Martha stared at those bills, another thought crept in. If Daniel was alive, if he'd been alive all these years, what did that mean about the night Emily disappeared? The official story had always been that they'd run away together, two teenagers in love who'd gotten caught in the Christmas Eve blizzard. Search and rescue had found Daniel's body first, frozen in Devil's Creek. Emily had never been found, but everyone assumed the same fate. Romeo and Juliet in a mountain town, the sheriff had said with grim poetry. Martha had lived with that story for 30 years, had built her grief around it, shaped her guilt to fit its contours. But if Daniel was alive... The knock at her front door came at exactly 7:30, sharp and insistent. Martha's coffee cup clattered against the saucer as she set it down. No one visited her anymore. Her few remaining friends had drifted away after the bakery closed, their discomfort with her reduced circumstances palpable as the scent of failure. She peered through the lace curtains and felt her heart skip. A Pine Ridge Sheriff's patrol car sat in her driveway, its white paint stark against the snow. Sheriff Tom Walsh stood on her porch, his weathered face grim beneath his campaign hat. Martha had known Tom since high school. He'd been 2 years ahead of Emily, had even asked her to prom before Daniel came along. The rejection had stung him, Martha remembered, though he'd handled it with the grace that would later make him a good lawman. Tom. Martha opened the door, pulling her robe tighter against the morning chill. "This is early, even for you." "Morning, Martha." His brown eyes held the careful neutrality he'd perfected over 20 years of keeping Pine Ridge's peace. "Mind if I come in? Got some questions about yesterday." Market. Someone had talked, of course. In a town of 1,200 souls, Daniel Crawford's resurrection would spread faster than butter on warm bread. Martha stepped aside, gesturing him into her living room. Tom removed his hat, running thick fingers through grey-streaked hair. He'd put on weight over the years, his uniform straining slightly across his middle, but his presence still commanded respect. "Heard you had an interesting customer yesterday." Someone who looked familiar. Martha perched on the edge of her armchair, her mind racing. "People buy pies, Tom. That's how commerce works." "Don't play games with me." His voice carried the authority of his badge, but underneath, she heard something else. Old pain, carefully banked, but never fully extinguished. "Mrs. Peterson says the man who bought your pies looked just like Danny Crawford. Says he knew your name, talked like he'd known you before. Mrs. Peterson sees Jimmy Hoffa in her breakfast toast. You know that." Tom leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Martha, if there's even a chance that Danny Crawford is alive." "There isn't." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "We buried him, Tom. You were there. You helped carry the coffin." "We buried an empty box." His eyes never left her face. "You know that as well as I do. Never found enough of him to fill a shoebox after that creek got done with him." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, Martha could hear the morning sounds of Pine Ridge waking up, car doors slamming, children calling to each other on their way to school, the distant rumble of the snowplow making its rounds. Normal life continuing while her world tilted on its axis. Even if it was him, Martha said carefully, what would that change? Emily's still gone. Something flickered across Tom's face. A shadow of the 18-year-old boy who'd watched his first love choose another. It would change everything, and you know it. If Danny's alive, if he's been alive all this time, then every assumption we made about that night was wrong. Martha felt the familiar weight of secrets pressing against her chest. There were things she'd never told anyone, not the sheriff, not the search teams, not even Bill in their most intimate moments. Things about the fight she'd had with Emily that Christmas Eve, about the words that could never be taken back, about the real reason her daughter had run into the storm. "I made the last pies I'll ever make yesterday," she said quietly. "I'm done with that part of my life." Tom studied her for a long moment, then stood and settled his hat back on his head. "If you see him again, Martha, you call me. Promise?" Martha walked him to the door, her hand steady on the knob despite the chaos in her heart. As his patrol car disappeared down Maple Street, she realized she stood at a crossroads she'd never wanted to face. She could call Tom back, tell him the truth, let the law handle whatever came next. Or she could drive up into the mountains and find Daniel Crawford herself, finally ask the questions that had been eating at her soul for 30 years. The rational choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. But as Martha looked at the $300 bills still sitting on her kitchen table, she knew she'd already made her decision. Some truths were worth risking everything to find, even if they destroyed you. Martha stared at the $300 bills until her vision blurred, the numbers swimming like they were underwater. The smart thing would be to deposit them at First National, pay her electric bill, buy groceries that weren't past their expiration date. The safe thing would be to pretend yesterday never happened, that Daniel Crawford was still dead and buried in Pine Ridge Cemetery under a headstone that read, "Beloved son, taken too soon." But Martha had spent 30 years doing the smart thing, the safe thing, and where had it gotten her? Alone in a house that felt too big and too empty, selling the last remnants of a life that had once held joy. She pushed back from the kitchen table and began to pace, her slippers whispering against the worn linoleum. Each step took her past the empty spaces where her life used to live, the bare walls, the silent corners where Emily's laughter once echoed, the kitchen island where she'd taught her daughter to roll pie crust with gentle hands and infinite patience. What if he knows something? The thought crept in like morning fog, insidious and impossible to ignore. What if Daniel saw something that night, knew something about why Emily really ran? But that way lay madness. Martha had learned the hard way that hope was the cruelest emotion, the one that convinced you to keep fighting when surrender would be kinder. She'd hoped for 3 days while the search teams combed the mountains. She'd hoped for 3 months while the investigation continued. She'd hoped for 3 years, until the case went cold, and even Tom Walsh stopped asking questions. Hope had nearly killed her. The phone rang, jarring her from her spiral. Martha's hands shook as she answered, half expecting to hear Daniel's voice on the other end. "Martha, it's Carol from St. Mary's." The church secretary's voice was bright with forced cheer. "I wanted to remind you about the Christmas food drive meeting tonight. 7 o'clock in the fellowship hall. Christmas." Martha had forgotten it was coming. Or rather, she'd tried to forget. The holiday that had once filled her home with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg, with Emily's excited chatter about presents and plans, with Bill's terrible attempts at wrapping gifts. Now it was just another day to survive, another anniversary of loss. "I don't think I can make it," Martha said. "Oh, but we're counting on you. Your organizational skills, your experience with the bakery." "The bakery's gone, Carol. Has been for 3 years. A pause. "Well, yes, but you still have so much to offer. The community needs—" Martha hung up. She couldn't bear to hear about what the community needed, not when her own needs felt like an abyss she'd never escape. The community hadn't needed her when the medical bills started piling up after Bill's heart attack. They hadn't needed her when the bank foreclosed on everything she'd built. They certainly didn't need her now, a broken-down woman with nothing left to give. But Daniel had needed her pies. The thought stopped her cold. He'd driven down from wherever he'd been hiding for 30 years, sought out the Christmas market, found her stand among all the others. He'd paid 3 times what those pies were worth, and looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. When was the last time anyone had looked at her that way? Martha caught her reflection in the kitchen window. Grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, lines etched deep around her mouth, eyes that had forgotten how to hope. She looked like what she was, a 62-year-old woman who'd given up on everything except getting through each day. But yesterday, for just a moment, she'd felt like the woman who used to command a kitchen like a conductor leading an orchestra. The woman who'd built something beautiful from flour and sugar and love. The woman Emily used to call the Pie Queen of Colorado. Her car keys sat on the hook by the back door, right where Bill used to hang his work gloves. The Honda was old but reliable, and she knew these mountain roads like her own heartbeat. She could drive up toward Devil's Creek, maybe catch sight of wherever Daniel had gone. Just to see, just to know. And then what? The rational voice in her head sounded suspiciously like Bill. You corner a man who's been hiding for 30 years and demand answers. What makes you think he'll tell you anything he didn't tell the sheriff back then? Because she was Emily's mother. Because she'd loved that boy once, welcomed him into her home, trusted him with her daughter's heart. Because some bonds ran deeper than time or secrets or even death. But what if the answers were worse than the questions? What if Daniel knew something that would shatter the careful peace she'd built from the ashes of her old life? Martha had survived losing Emily by believing in the story everyone told. Star-crossed lovers, tragic accident, no one to blame. What if that story was a lie? The money seemed to mock her from the table, promising possibility and threatening destruction in equal measure. Outside, snow began to fall again, the same soft flakes that had been falling 30 years ago when her world ended. Martha reached for her coat, then stopped. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But she was so tired of being afraid. Martha's hand closed around her car keys with a finality that sent tremors through her chest. The metal was cold against her palm, but not as cold as the fear that had lived in her bones for 3 decades. She pulled on her winter coat, the same navy wool she'd worn to Bill's funeral, the one with the loose button she kept meaning to fix, and wrapped her grandmother's knitted scarf around her throat. The Honda's engine protested against the morning chill, coughing twice before settling into its familiar rumble. As she backed out of her driveway, Martha caught sight of Mrs. Peterson peering through her front window, no doubt already reaching for her phone to spread the news that Martha Holloway was up to something suspicious. Let her talk. After today, Martha might have bigger things to worry about than small-town gossip. The road toward Devil's Creek wound through the heart of Pine Ridge, past the shuttered storefront that used to house Holloway's bakery. Martha forced herself not to look, but her peripheral vision caught the faded for lease sign that had hung in the window for 3 years. Some wounds never stopped bleeding. As the houses thinned and the forest pressed closer to the road, Martha felt the last threads connecting her to her careful, controlled life beginning to fray. Every mile took her further from the woman who paid bills and cleaned other people's houses and pretended that survival was enough. Every turn of the wheels carried her toward a truth she might not survive intact. The snow fell heavier now, fat flakes that caught in her windshield wipers and blurred the world into impressionist smears of white and green. This was how it had started 30 years ago. Innocent snow that became a blizzard, gentle flakes that became a curtain between the living and the dead. "Turn back." The voice in her head sounded like her mother now, practical and disapproving. "You've lost enough. Don't throw away what little peace you have left." But peace built on lies wasn't peace at all. It was just a prettier name for surrender. And Martha was done surrendering. She passed the old logging road where teenagers used to park on summer nights, the scenic overlook where tourists stopped to photograph the valley, the hiking trail where she and Bill used to walk before his heart gave out. Each landmark felt like a goodbye to the life she'd been living, the safe cocoon she'd wrapped around herself to keep the dangerous emotions at bay. The road to Devil's Creek branched off to the right, climbing steeply through stands of pine and aspen. Martha's Honda labored against the grade, but she pressed on, following tire tracks that looked fresh in the snow. Someone had come this way recently. Someone driving a vehicle that left deep, wide impressions in the slush. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the trees opened into a small clearing. A cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, smoke rising from its chimney like a prayer made visible. The structure looked hand-built, weathered but solid, with solar panels glinting on the roof and a woodshed stacked high with split logs. A pickup truck sat in the driveway, its paint faded but its tires new. This was it. This was where 30 years of questions would finally find their answers. Martha parked beside the truck and sat for a moment, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Through the cabin's front window, she could see warm light and moving shadows, proof that Daniel Crawford had built himself a life in these mountains while the world below believed him dead. The first step out of her car felt like stepping off a cliff. The snow crunched under her boots, a sound that seemed loud as gunshots in the crystalline air. Each footfall toward the cabin's front door carried the weight of irrevocable choice. She was done with safe, done with small, done with pretending that not knowing was better than facing the truth. Martha climbed the wooden steps, raised her fist to knock, and felt the last of her old life fall away like snow sliding from a roof. Whatever waited on the other side of this door, answers or more pain, closure or fresh wounds, she would meet it with the strength of a woman who had already lost everything that mattered. The door opened before she could knock. Daniel Crawford stood in the threshold, dressed in worn flannel and faded jeans, his grey eyes unsurprised to see her. Snowflakes caught in his dark beard, and she could smell wood smoke and coffee and something else, something that reminded her of the boy who used to help her carry groceries, who had loved her daughter with the fierce devotion of first love. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said quietly, and Martha knew there was no going back. "Come in," Daniel said, stepping back from the doorway. "You must be freezing." Martha hesitated on the threshold, suddenly aware of how far she'd traveled from everything familiar. The warmth from inside beckoned, but crossing into Daniel's world felt like accepting an invitation she might regret. Still, the mountain air cut through her coat like a blade, and she stepped inside. The cabin's interior surprised her. She'd expected something rough, makeshift, the dwelling of a man hiding from the world. Instead, she found herself in a space that spoke of careful craftsmanship and quiet comfort. Hand-hewn beams supported the ceiling, and built-in bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on everything from philosophy to forestry management. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth crackling with split pine that filled the room with golden light. "Coffee?" Daniel moved toward a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Copper pots hanging from wrought iron hooks, butcher block, counters worn smooth by use, herbs drying in bunches by the window. Yes. Thank you." Martha's voice sounded strange in her own ears, formal and distant. She remained standing, her purse clutched tight against her chest like armor. Daniel poured coffee from a French press into 2 heavy ceramic mugs, the kind Martha remembered making in her high school pottery class. Everything here felt intentional, chosen with care rather than accumulated by accident. This wasn't the home of a man running from something. This was a sanctuary built by someone who'd found what he was looking for. "Sit, please." He gestured toward a leather chair positioned near the fire. "You didn't drive all this way to admire my decor." Martha perched on the edge of the chair, accepting the mug with hands that trembled only slightly. The coffee was perfect, rich and dark, with hints of chocolate that reminded her of Sunday mornings when Emily was small. "Everyone thinks you're dead." "I know." Daniel settled into the chair across from her, his movements deliberate and calm. Up close she could see how the years had changed him. The boy who dated her daughter had been lean to the point of hunger, all elbows and earnest intensity. This man carried himself with the solid presence of someone comfortable in his own skin. It seemed easier that way. "Easier?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Do you know what your disappearance did to this town? To your family? Your mother mourned you for 15 years before cancer took her." Something flickered across Daniel's face, pain quickly contained but unmistakable. "I know. I was at her funeral." Martha's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "You were?" "Back of the cemetery, behind the old oak. I watched them lower her into the ground and wanted to run to the grave, but too many people would have asked questions I couldn't answer." His voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully tended. "Some choices can't be undone, Martha. You make them and then you live with the consequences, even when they tear pieces off your soul." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Martha found herself studying this man who'd once been like a son to her. She'd taught him to make biscuits in her kitchen, had watched him and Emily slow dance to the radio while dinner cooled on the stove. He'd called her Mrs. H back then, had thanked her politely for every meal, every kindness. Why? The question hung between them like smoke. Why fake your own death? Why stay hidden all these years? Daniel was quiet for so long that Martha wondered if he'd answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I knew something about that night, about what really happened to Emily." Martha's world tilted. The careful walls she'd built around her pain, the stories she'd told herself for 3 decades. Everything shifted like snow sliding toward an avalanche. "What do you mean?" "The official story was wrong. We didn't run away together. We didn't have some Romeo and Juliet pact." Daniel's grey eyes met hers, and she saw a depth of sorrow that matched her own. "Emily was running from something, Martha, someone, and when I tried to help her, I learned things about Pine Ridge, about people we both trusted, that would have gotten us both killed if I'd stayed." The room seemed to shrink around Martha. Her carefully controlled breathing became shallow, rapid. "That's impossible. The sheriff investigated." "The sheriff was part of it." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Tom Walsh, who'd helped search for Emily, who'd comforted Martha in her darkest hours, who'd carried an empty coffin at Daniel's funeral. "You're lying." But even as she said it, Martha remembered things that had never quite fit. The investigation that went cold too quickly. Evidence that disappeared. Tom's insistence that the case was closed, that searching for answers would only cause more pain. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I can prove it. But I tell you everything. If you learn what I learned that night, there's no going back. You'll be in the same danger Emily was in, the same danger that's kept me hiding in these mountains for 30 years. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and Martha understood that she stood at the edge of an abyss that would swallow everything she thought she knew about her daughter's death, about her town, about the man she'd trusted to find Emily's killer. The smart choice was to leave. The safe choice was to walk away, but Emily deserved better than smart or safe. "Tell me," Martha whispered. Daniel rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man who'd learned that sudden gestures could mean the difference between life and death. He walked to a wooden desk tucked beneath the window and pulled out a manila folder, its edges worn soft from handling. When he returned, Martha could see her daughter's name written across the front in Daniel's neat handwriting. "I've carried this for 30 years, he said, setting the folder on the coffee table between them. Every newspaper clipping, every police report I could get my hands on, every detail I remembered from that night." His fingers traced Emily's name like a prayer. "Your daughter was investigating something, Martha. Something that went to the very heart of Pine Ridge." Martha's coffee had gone cold in her hands, but she didn't notice. The folder seemed to pulse with dangerous energy, promising answers she'd craved and dreaded in equal measure. Emily was 17. What could she possibly have been investigating? Missing girls. Daniel's voice carried the weight of buried secrets. 3 of them over the span of 5 years, all around Emily's age, all from families that didn't have much money or influence. Girls whose disappearances got written off as runaways. The fire crackled, but Martha felt ice spreading through her veins. "I don't remember any missing girls, because the stories were buried. Page 6 of the local paper, if they made the news at all. Troubled teens running away from home, that was always the official line." Daniel opened a folder, revealing newspaper clippings yellowed with age. But Emily saw a pattern. She'd been volunteering at the crisis center, talking to other girls who'd had encounters, close calls they couldn't quite explain. Martha's hands shook as she reached for the clippings. Sarah Chen, age 16, last seen leaving her job at the grocery store. Rebecca Martinez, 17, disappeared after a school dance. Jennifer Walsh. Walsh. Martha's voice cracked. "As in Sheriff Walsh?" "His niece. Which is why I thought I could trust him when Emily went missing." Daniel's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I was so damn young, so sure that the law would help us. I told Tom everything Emily had shared with me about the missing girls, about the man she'd seen watching them." "What man?" But even as Martha asked, she felt pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity, the way Tom Walsh had shut down leads that pointed anywhere but toward the official narrative. His insistence that Emily and Daniel had run away together, the investigation that died before it ever really began. Someone with money, someone with connections. Emily never got a clear look at his face, but she knew his car, a black sedan with tinted windows that showed up wherever vulnerable girls gathered. The youth center, the bus stop by the high school, the parking lot behind Murphy's Diner where kids went to smoke. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. She was going to expose him, had been collecting evidence for months. Martha felt the room spinning around her. Her careful, studious daughter, the girl who'd rather read than socialize, had been playing detective in a game that cost lives. Why didn't she tell me? She tried. Do you remember, the week before she disappeared? She kept starting conversations with you about safety, about being careful around strangers. She wanted to tell you everything, but she was scared you wouldn't believe her, scared you'd make her stop. Daniel's eyes were gentle, understanding. You were working 3 jobs after your husband's accident. Emily didn't want to add to your burden. The weight of missed opportunities crushed against Martha's chest. How many times had Emily started to say something important, only to be cut off by Martha's exhaustion, her endless worry about bills and medical expenses? How many chances had she squandered to save her daughter's life? The night she disappeared, Martha whispered, "She called me at work. Said she needed to talk about something important. She'd found him, the man in the black sedan." Daniel's voice dropped to barely audible. She'd gotten his license plate, tracked down his real name. She was terrified but excited. She thought she could finally get justice for those other girls. "So, she called you. And I told her to meet me at Devil's Creek. Neutral ground, I thought. Safe." Daniel's face contorted with old pain. "But someone else got to her first. When I arrived, I found her car empty, driver's side door hanging open, her purse scattered across the ground like she'd been dragged out in a hurry." Martha's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone hearth. The crash seemed to echo through 30 years of careful denial, breaking apart the story she'd told herself about star-crossed lovers and tragic accidents. "I called Sheriff Walsh from the payphone at Murphy's," Daniel continued. his voice mechanical now, reciting facts that had haunted him for decades. He showed up fast, too fast, like he'd been waiting for my call, and when he looked at Emily's abandoned car, I saw something in his eyes that froze my blood. What? Recognition. He wasn't surprised, Martha. He was relieved. The word hit Martha like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. She gripped the arms of the leather chair, her knuckles white against the worn material, as 30 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled around her. Relieved, she repeated, the syllables tasting like ash in her mouth. You're saying Tom Walsh, the man who held me while I sobbed over Emily's empty grave, was relieved to find her missing. Daniel's face was carved from granite, his grey eyes holding truths that had clearly eaten at him for decades. I was 18, Martha, young and stupid and so goddamn scared I could barely think straight, but I wasn't blind. Tom didn't examine the scene like a man trying to solve a crime. He examined it like a man making sure a job was done right. The fire's warmth couldn't touch the ice spreading through Martha's veins. She thought of Tom Walsh at Emily's memorial service, his weathered face solemn as he spoke about tragic accidents and young love gone wrong. She remembered his wife bringing casseroles, his awkward attempts to comfort a grieving mother. All of it, every moment of supposed compassion, had been an elaborate lie. He killed her. The words came out as a whisper, but they filled the cabin like a scream. Tom Walsh murdered my daughter. No. Daniel's response was immediate, certain. Tom was the cleanup crew, the man who made sure the truth stayed buried. But Emily's killer... He reached for another folder, this one bound with a rubber band that snapped like a gunshot in the quiet room. That honor belongs to someone else entirely. Martha's hands trembled as Daniel opened the second folder. Inside were photographs, surveillance shots, newspaper clippings, what looked like pages torn from a high school yearbook. Her eyes struggled to focus, but one face kept appearing across the scattered documents. A face she recognized. No. The denial ripped from her throat. That's impossible. Judge William Thorne, Daniel said quietly. Pillar of the community, respected civic leader, and a predator who'd been hunting Pine Ridge's most vulnerable girls for over a decade. Martha stared at the photograph. Thorne at a charity gala, his silver hair gleaming under ballroom lights, his smile warm and grandfatherly. She'd served him coffee at the diner where she'd worked weekends, had watched him preside over traffic court with patient dignity, had even voted for him, twice. Emily found bank records, Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Thorne had been making cash payments to Tom Walsh for years, small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, but after each girl disappeared, the payments got larger. By the time Jennifer Walsh went missing, Tom was receiving $5,000 every month. Jennifer was his own niece, which is how I know Tom wasn't calling the shots. A man doesn't sell his own blood for money, but he might sacrifice her to save his own skin. Thorne had something on Tom, evidence of corruption maybe, or threats against Tom's family. By the time Jenny disappeared, Tom was trapped as completely as any of those girls. Martha's world tilted sideways. She thought of Judge Thorne's funeral 5 years ago. The packed church, the glowing eulogies, the way the entire town had mourned his passing. She'd been there, had even signed the condolence book, had grieved for a man who'd murdered her daughter. Where's the proof? Her voice sounded strange, distant. If you knew all this, why didn't you... Because I'm dead, remember? Daniel's laugh was bitter. The night I figured it out, I went to my apartment to gather evidence. Found 2 of Thorne's men waiting for me. They made it very clear that Daniel Crawford was going to have a tragic accident, just like those poor missing girls. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow, pale and twisted, the kind of mark left by something sharp and deliberately applied. I got lucky. Managed to get away, but just barely. Spent 3 days hiding in these mountains, bleeding and half dead from exposure, before I understood the only way to survive was to disappear completely. His fingers traced the old wound, so I staged my own death. Made it look like I'd fallen into the rapids during a night climb. Let the current carry away my jacket and boots, while I crawled deeper into the wilderness. The magnitude of his sacrifice hit Martha like an avalanche. Daniel had given up everything, his name, his family, his future, to survive long enough to carry this truth. For 30 years he'd lived as a ghost, waiting for justice that would never come. "Thorne is dead," she whispered. "Tom Walsh retired to Arizona 10 years ago. What's the point of telling me this now?" Daniel leaned forward, his eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded her of the passionate boy who'd loved her daughter. "Because predators like Thorne don't work alone, Martha, and some debts can be passed down through generations." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and Martha realized her ordeal was only beginning. Martha's hands went numb, the photographs scattering to the floor like autumn leaves. "What do you mean, passed down through generations?" Daniel's face had gone ashen, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw fear flicker in his weathered eyes. "Judge Thorne had a son, Marcus. He's been quietly taking over his father's interests." The name hit Martha like ice water. Marcus Thorne, Pine Ridge's ambitious young mayor, the man who'd been revitalizing the town, bringing in new businesses and tourism. The man whose development project had forced her to sell the bakery building 3 years ago. "Marcus bought my building," she whispered. "He said it was for downtown development, but nothing ever got built. It's just empty." "How much did he pay you, Martha?" She thought back to that humiliating day in the lawyer's office, signing papers that ended 40 years of dreams, below market value. "He said it was all the town could afford, that I was lucky to get anything given my husband's debts. I needed the money for Robert's medical bills, so I—" Her voice died as understanding crashed over her. Marcus Thorne hadn't bought her building for development. He'd bought it to erase the last trace of the Holloway family from Pine Ridge's main street, just like his father had erased Emily. "He's been watching you," Daniel said quietly. "Ever since you started asking questions about Emily again. Ever since you began making those pies." Martha's blood turned to ice. "The pies?" "Emily's recipe. The one that made your family bakery famous. The one that brought people together, made them talk." Daniel's voice carried terrible certainty. "You've been stirring up memories, Martha, reminding people of what Pine Ridge was like before the Thornes reshaped it. That makes you dangerous." The room seemed to shrink around her. Every kind word Marcus had spoken at town meetings, every sympathetic smile when discussing her financial struggles, all of it had been calculated manipulation. He'd been dismantling her life piece by piece, the same way his father had destroyed Emily. "The Christmas market," she breathed. "He organized it. He's the one who invited me to sell pies." Daniel nodded grimly. A public farewell. Let the whole town see Martha Holloway fail one last time, then disappear quietly into obscurity. Except something went wrong with his plan. "You," she whispered. "You bought every pie. And in doing so, I've painted a target on both our backs." Daniel moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the snow-covered landscape beyond. Marcus can't afford to have people asking why the hermit mountain man suddenly appeared to help Emily Holloway's mother. Can't risk anyone connecting the dots between past and present. As if summoned by their conversation, the distant rumble of engines echoed through the pines. Daniel's face went deadly still. "How did you get here, Martha?" "I drove. My car's parked at the trailhead." Even as she said it, she realized her mistake. She'd left a trail that led directly to Daniel's sanctuary, destroying 30 years of careful hiding with her desperate need for answers. "They followed you." Daniel's voice was eerily calm, the tone of a man who'd always known this moment would come. "Marcus must have had someone watching you, waiting to see if you'd lead them to me." The engine sounds grew closer, multiple vehicles winding up the mountain road. Through the window, Martha could see the first gleam of headlights cutting through the snowfall. "There's a back trail," Daniel said, already moving toward a closet where winter gear hung ready. "I can get you out through the ravine, but we have to go now." Martha stood frozen, her mind reeling from the magnitude of what she'd unleashed. In seeking the truth about Emily's death, she'd signed Daniel's death warrant. The man who'd sacrificed everything to preserve her daughter's memory would die because of her selfish need for answers. "I'm not running." The words surprised her with their steadiness. "I'm 62 years old, Daniel. I've already lost everything that mattered to me. If Marcus Thorne wants to finish what his father started, let him try." "Martha, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." She moved to the fireplace, gripping the poker with hands that no longer trembled. "I understand that the Thorne family has been stealing daughters from this town for decades. I understand that good people like Tom Walsh got turned into monsters through fear and blackmail. And I understand that if I run now, Emily's death will never mean anything." The vehicles were close enough now that she could hear doors slamming, voices calling out coordinates in the darkness. Daniel grabbed her arm, his eyes desperate. "Emily wouldn't want you to die for her." Martha met his gaze, and for the first time in 30 years, felt something like peace settle in her chest. Maybe not. "But she'd want me to fight for the girls who come after her, the ones who might still have a chance." Outside, boots crunched through snow toward the cabin door.